This is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here at Real Story Group, and our founder, Tony Byrne, who recently co-authored the book, The Right Way to Select Technology, will be joining us on the line momentarily. But first, I did want to mention a couple quick things about Real Story Group. And before we even get into that, I do want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to join us. This should be a really fast-moving presentation, and we're excited to have you join us. CRM is the newest addition to our research portfolio, and it's one of 8 markets that we cover as part of our evaluations. Because fundamentally, we are an analyst firm, and we publish detailed critiques about the vendors in these spaces. And really, we don't describe what's going to be the best and what's the worst vendor, but rather what's going to be the right fit for what it is you're trying to do. And so we do that with our research, but also with our tools, where you can actually create a customized shortlist of the vendors that best fit your particular criteria, and then also compare those vendors side by side to see their strengths and weaknesses and how they could match up to, again, your shortlist and what it is you're trying to do. We also have developed a tool a couple years back called Real Score, where you can measure your digital effectiveness, and then you can benchmark yourselves against your industry peers. But we also will come on site if need be and act as an extension of your team to whether it's develop a strategic roadmap or help you through a technology selection project. What's different about Real Story Group versus other analyst firms you may have come across in the past is the fact that we don't do any work for the vendors that we cover. So we don't speak at their conferences or write white papers or advise them on their strategy. Our only focus is to be on your side of the table as a technology user and buyer. So as I mentioned, we cover 8 different marketplaces, and here's a snapshot of the vendors that we cover in those particular areas. So you'll see that there's really 2 major buckets that we cover within the research. It's digital marketing, so outward-facing or customer-facing technology, and also digital workplace technology, so more internally focused, such as enterprise collaboration or enterprise portals. Today, we're going to focus on the orange line, which is CRM or customer relationship management technology. And with that, I'll turn things over to Tony to take you through the presentation. Tony?
Thanks, Scott. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to tell a little bit of story about how we started Real Story Group, originally CMS Watch, back in 2001. I was working for a systems integration firm, and we had to implement early stage document and content management systems, some early what were kind of nascent CRM tools. And our customers would come and say, well, we got this vendor because they were in the upper right hand corner of this quadrant, so they must be really good, right? And then we would go and implement it and often run into problems and realize that there was a real disconnect between traditional kind of analyst ratings and whether a product was going to be a good fit for you. And then once I dug deeper, I found out there were all kinds of conflicts of interest in this. And so I decided to start to create an analyst firm that would really dig into more of the details, sit solely on the customer side of the table, and really understand what tools would create the right fit for you, as opposed to generic pros and cons about the different vendors. So as Scott mentioned, we started covering, after pretty substantial subscriber demand, started covering customer relationship management last year, where we evaluate 8 different vendors. We're going to be expanding that over time and really looking again at the pros and cons of these tools relative to different types of customer circumstances. Of course, CRM is always part of a larger digital engagement picture. Sometimes we'll talk about the MarTech mall, where there's just some key anchor technologies that you have to master. And CRM, obviously, you can see in the lower right, is one of those, right? You've got to get CRM right. And because it's foundational to many other things that you want to do relative to customers. Now, you may or may not be into commerce and sales, personalization. Perhaps you're doing advertising and promotions. Maybe you're doing other outbound stuff like webinars and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different technologies potentially in your mall, but some are really anchor and some are more boutique type technologies. And so CRM we define really as one of the anchors, and so it's really critical to get this right. So getting the right vendor, of course, doesn't guarantee you success, but we think it's really kind of table stakes for then setting your team up to be successful going forward. And what's interesting that we're seeing now, and I'll get into this in a minute, is a lot of change and flux in the CRM marketplace, and a number of our subscribers really reconsidering their CRM investments and reconsidering whether they're with the right partner going forward. So we break down the marketplace, the CRM marketplace, into kind of two broad types of vendors. So on the one hand, you have these multi-product suite vendors that have multiple different platforms that they'll often call clouds. Whether they're actually in the cloud or not is a different story. That nominally they're trying to sell as a collection of tools or a suite, right? So these tools are all typically freestanding, very often acquired from other vendors. And so very often a customer will actually sort of buy them a la carte. So maybe you're working with Oracle and you'll get their Service Cloud, but maybe not their Support Cloud or maybe not their Marketing Cloud. And likewise, with Salesforce and Microsoft and SAP. So these are suite type vendors, and the idea is, well, you're working with a single vendor, but the tools may or may not be well integrated. Then on the right, you see these more unified type platforms where often within a single interface, in fact, they'll have multiple different modules that are more or less unified within a single package. There's obviously pros and cons to this. The pro for some customers is that, okay, all of these capabilities are all in one place. I'm not having to deal with all of these different clouds that may be based on different technologies and so forth. The disadvantage, of course, is that sometimes this can be overwhelming. It's highly complicated. If we're a larger enterprise that have different use cases where a salesperson doesn't need to have access to the service and support capabilities, then that becomes kind of a clutter and overkill for me. So we're not making value judgments here. We're just saying that in general, from an architectural perspective, you can break down the marketplace into two different types of vendors. So let's talk about some trends, what's going on in the marketplace. So we have, again, as you see the middle, the multi-product suites and then unified vendors. Then what's interesting about CRM that we're seeing is that there's a whole broad set of smaller or legacy type platforms that many organizations are on. Like, just in the higher ed space, there's probably 10 to 12 different sort of boutique higher ed CRM vendors, right? And it's the same thing around manufacturing, around consumer goods and other sorts of things where we see these sort of legacy vertical, or in some cases even regional vendors or smaller and simpler solutions that were designed for SMBs that sometimes, the firm can outgrow. So we're beginning to see, certainly in some cases, we'll see some customers sort of downgrade, I'll say, from a multi-product suite that was just too much for them. It was too big, it was too expensive, too developer intensive, into something more specialized. But we're seeing an even bigger trend going the other way, particularly among our subscriber base, of organizations saying, look, I need to work with a larger vendor where there's an ecosystem. And in particular, as our MarTech mall gets bigger and bigger and I have all these different boutiques that I'm adding into my stack, I need to have access to a platform that has connectors and APIs and so forth that's very pluggable, that I can plug other systems into, because CRM, of course, can be very foundational. Likewise, we also sometimes see some multi-product suite vendors go, again, dealing with the cost and complexity of these multiple different platforms and say, look, I just overbought here. I need something a little bit more unified, in particular, something that maybe work in particular for my industry. But once again, we're also seeing a little bit of a trend the other way, where some of these systems, as I get large, as my sophistication grows and I have more specialized talent working within that CRM, is that sometimes this kind of unified one size fits all with all the different capabilities in a single interface, that becomes too unified, and I need to break this up into more specialized services. But there's some general customer challenges that we're seeing, and I think one is a recognition of the overall complexity of these systems, which very often, we've underestimated. A lot of this is, of course, around the overall complexity and growing complexity of our CRM needs themselves as we become more digitally engage with our customers and prospects. And as I mentioned, there's issues with the smaller legacy systems, lack of scalability, interoperability, and ecosystem. Some difficulty in orchestrating the modules and add-on suites in systems like Salesforce. That's driving this arrow up here. But then in some cases, a lack of universal robustness in these unified platforms. So I may get something like Sugar CRM, which covers a lot of my different CRM use cases, but it's kind of weak when it comes to analytics. So, maybe what I'd like to be able to do is sort of break these things apart so I can be a little bit more best of breed about this. So it's a marketplace in transition. I'm not telling you here that you should go with one type or another. We'll show you in a minute a methodology for figuring out what's a good fit, but there's definitely some trends that we should all be aware of here. So let's look then in terms of, these are the sorts of features that we look at in general around some enterprise considerations around CRM. So this is kind of a feature-oriented review of, administration and management. What's the application development environment, integration extensibility, obviously BI and reporting, mobile capabilities, scale, very critical. Security entitlements is a big one, particularly for large organizations. So these are some enterprise considerations you want to keep in mind. But at the end of the day, these are features, right? And so you want to be able to evaluate them, but evaluate them in the context of how it's going to be used. And so the thing that we really focus on is what is the right scenario fit. So here's our evaluation of Sugar CRM. And you can see that Sugar is very oriented towards sales and process management and customer service, where we give them, between half to 3/4 of a Harvey ball here. Much weaker when it comes to field service scenarios or marketing. So a lot of this depends, of course, on that age-old question, what are you going to use this technology for? And so the key thing here is to sort of get beyond kind of core features and look at more scenario or use case driven kind of analysis and evaluation of these tools. And then likewise, you always want to look at strategic considerations, right? So the issue around Sugar CRM, when you break it down, is that the ecosystem is relatively strong. The product has a decent kind of strategic prospects. The issue is really weakness around the vendor itself, right? And so that doesn't mean you shouldn't license Sugar CRM, but you want to understand kind of going in what are going to be the pros and cons of working with this vendor in this ecosystem, and what do I need to do to mitigate this? There's other vendors in this marketplace where the strategic consideration on the vendor itself may be a little bit stronger, but the ecosystem is weaker. And a weak ecosystem is often a real challenge, potentially prohibitive challenge for the long-term value and sustainability of the tool itself. So you definitely want to be looking at strategic considerations as well around both the vendor, the product, as well as the overall ecosystem. But this brings us to the question of, okay, so how do you go about selecting? What's the best way to select this technology? And as Scott mentioned, my colleague Jared and I wrote a book last year, The Right Way to Select Technology. It's not just about CRM, it's about anything that's customer or employee facing that's really critical for your enterprise. And what we tried to do was apply some modern design thinking methodologies to a process that traditionally most enterprises do in a very waterfall type way. And so the point here is to be a little bit more agile-ish about this and bring in some agile concepts like the notion of an interdisciplinary team, following a more test-based process as opposed to kind of a feature checklist process, to iterate and adapt your process so that as you learn more about what you need, you can then filter down and get to the right solution. Let's talk about this then in the context of the CRM marketplace. Okay, so you're out looking at CRM technology. Obviously, you want to build an interdisciplinary selection team. So obviously, the teams from services, support, marketing, however you define your CRM needs, the business side need to be actively engaged and have stakeholders, and in fact, ultimately have a business person lead the selection team. But it's really critical, even if you get a cloud platform, or even especially if you get a cloud-based platform, to involve your technology team as well, both from a security and systems perspective, but also obviously with respect to critical issues around data integration. And ultimately, almost all these tools, you're going to be engaging some developer resources. And you can't forget that you are, to the extent that you need developer resources, you really want to understand how that's going to work for your development team going forward. So build an interdisciplinary selection team, and then you go through, as we described, an iterative process of winnowing down to the best fit. So you may start with the longest short list in the CRM space. It may be more like 8 to 10 vendors rather than 10 to 12, but then you want to get to a short list of RFP recipients, which here, may be more like 4 to 6. We're big believers in RFPs, but RFPs done right. So not a kind of traditional check the box RFP, but more of a narrative RFP, and I'll explain that in a second. And you want to narrow down to vendor demos where they're testing your scripts, not their capabilities. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally get to a bake-off. And this is perhaps the most important part, and the part that most enterprises skip, much to their demerit. So the idea here is to actually have a hands-on proof of concept where you're not looking at somebody else using the technology, but you're actually using it yourself and testing it out against your key use cases. I can't stress this enough, how important it is for your team, both end users, administrators, and IT people, to get hands-on with the technology before you use it. So how do you get to the right short list? Well, you can go look at quadrants and waves that are out there, or you can go ahead and make your own. So I'm going to show you an example here that you can try yourself on our own website, where you look at the CRM Marketplace and then you decide, hey, what's important for you, and then weight those, and then generate what we call a real quadrant. So first, obviously, you want to do some filtering. Do I care if it's commercial or open source? Hopefully you don't, as those two have converged a lot. Do you want to install on-prem or in the cloud? Again, increasingly, obviously, we see it move to the cloud. In some cases, organizations, whether they like it or not, often they may not be able to do that. Geographic footprint may be important to you. The size of your enterprise, we often find really critical, right? So you don't want to necessarily overbuy or underbuy relative to not just what you can afford, but what you can handle. And then this notion of, do you already know a priori? Do you want more of a unified suite or a unified package, or more of a multi-product suite? In this case, we'll say, we can go either way. And then here's where things get interesting. So here's the two axes of a real quadrant, where on the left, we look at, okay, what are the different scenarios that are important to you? In this case, we just took all 5 and we weighted them evenly, but we could have said, hey, look, for us, for marketing, we've got a different marketing suite. We don't do a lot of process management. Our interest is really around customer service, field service, and sales, and so maybe I'm going to weight those a little bit differently. In this case, we'll make it all 100%. We'll make them each 20%, adding up to 100%. Then you look at the right. Okay, what are the strategic considerations that are really important to me? So in this case, maybe I want to be working with the vendor professional services for the implementation and then hand it off to my own internal team going forward. So I'm not necessarily looking for a systems integrator. So I'm going to overweight that a little bit. And I'm also going to overweight community strength, which we very often recommend, that particularly if I'm going to be managing this platform myself over time, I want to be able to tap into a rich community of peers and developers and independent consultants and others who can help me along the way. So then I put all this together and I generate what we call a real quadrant, right? So this then gives me a set of vendors in an order that's going to be suited to my particular unique needs. And then I can go from there. This doesn't tell me that I should necessarily go with vendor 4 all the way, but what this does tell me is that there's 4 or 5 vendors here that I ought to invite into the RFP, right? And then I can drill down and see what are the unique strengths and weaknesses, so I can understand kind of what to look out for as we bring them in to review their proposals and to have them demo. So that gets you, to a short list. But as you send out an RFP or request for demo to those vendors, there's a particular way that we encourage you to do this. And one is, kill your spreadsheets. The vendors have seen all of these requirements. They can check all of the boxes. How they differ is not necessarily what they do, but how they do it. So what you really want are testable narratives. And so the idea here is that you actually describe a particular business process with real people trying to do real things, right? And so ideally, this is a to-be process of how you want the system to work. This is what the vendors respond to in the RFP. This is what they come in and demo. So they're demoing your scripts, not theirs. And then this is what they come in if they make it to the bake-off round to actually show you how to do yourself. So you can then impersonate these different personas and actors in your system, whether it's a customer service rep, a field service rep, a marketer, whatever, whoever is using the CRM, you have these different journeys that they're following, and to be able to do it yourself. And then you know what's a good fit for you and what's not. Rather than saying, this system seems hard to use, you can actually say, it took me 6 clicks to register this customer complaint, whereas in the other system, it only took me 2, right? And then it helps you identify very specific pros and cons, including of the winning system, which will never be perfect, but you'll be able to understand, okay, what are the issues or problems, potential challenges with that winning solution, and what's the different kind of mitigation that we need to do going forward to make it ideal for us. And then always, always, always do a competitive proof of concept, aka a bake-off, using your real narratives, real data, real people, real environment. And this also gives you an opportunity not just to understand the technology, but also the vendor itself. And it gives you more time and space to negotiate around pricing. Time is your friend when it comes to pricing. Vendors will always want to push back and negotiate the pricing more towards the end of the process when they have more leverage over you and you're excited to get going and they hold all of the keys. What you want to do is, of course, start negotiating earlier rather than later, and to do this iteratively over time to make sure you're getting the best deal. Now, to be sure, running a bake-off like this, and for that matter, a really intense week of demos, it is resource intensive. I won't play that down. You will need a team that's really engaged, that's taken offline from their busy other commitments. But the point here is that A, you learn a lot about what your real requirements and needs are, and B, you're going to end up with a much better choice and a much better rationale for that choice in the end. And you avoid, of course, the dreaded failed implementation, which we've certainly seen in the CRM world, or just a poor choice that forces you to put square blocks into round holes, which we've seen quite a bit in the CRM space. And that becomes very expensive, very frustrating for your staff. So this is really about the value of getting to the right fit. The other interesting thing that we've seen over the 20 years that we've been advocating this is that you get from POC to pilot much faster because you've got a really clear sense for what it is that you actually bought, right? And so once you sign the license, you get to value much faster. All right. So just to remind you, if you're interested in learning more about the real pros and cons of these different vendors, I invite you to try out our research, which you can sample at this URL below. And of course, feel free to reach out with us to us with any questions. And if you have any questions at all, based on just what we said right now, we do have a few minutes now. So if you want to just get into the GoToWebinar control panel, there's a questions tab, and you can put in any comments, any disagreements, anything that you agree with, and of course, any questions that you might have. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to do that while Scott talks about next steps here.
Great, thanks, Tony. And it was great to take a look at the Real Quadrant application in particular. And if that's something that you'd like to explore in further detail along with the rest of the applications that we include with our research subscriptions, we encourage you to drop us a note here at explore@realstorygroup.com, and we'd be happy to schedule some time with you to learn more about your particular CRM project and how our research and tools could be helpful to help you make the right technology choice. One other thing I did want to mention in terms of our subscriptions is that you can also get access to Tony and the rest of our analyst team as part of our Plus offerings, where you get access to the research, the tools, as well as our analysts to really customize those types of discussions that are geared towards your specific needs. We can learn more about you and then help guide you to the right technology shortlist for CRM or any other markets that we cover. With that, I do want to see, Tony, are there any questions there in the community?
Yeah, we've got a couple here. The first one is from Brenda, who's asking, well, it's kind of sharing that, my organization switched from what you called a boutique CRM player to Salesforce, and it has been really frustrating. We find it an invitation to just spend more and more money. Well, that's true, and that can be true, and that's, of course, one of the issues with some of these big platforms, not just Salesforce, although we hear it a lot with Salesforce and to some extent Oracle, is that these systems often require a lot of customization, sometimes custom connectors and other sorts of things. It's really critical to get those user stories up front so that you understand what's going to be the level of effort in terms of integration before you license these tools. And it could very well be that in terms of some of the development costs or the third-party modules, that those could end up meeting or exceeding the actual licensing costs for Salesforce itself. So the total cost of ownership is never just the license, it's the full level of effort that's required to execute on what you need to do for the full scope of your CRM efforts. Okay, we also have another question from Sohaila, who's saying, what's going on with Redmond/Microsoft and online marketing? Well, that's a really good question. It seemed like Redmond was really headed towards expanding the Dynamics suite with respect to marketing capabilities, and they then kind of pulled back from that, entered into a partnership with Adobe that I think was largely around really pushing Azure more than anything else. We question that partnership because, Dynamics has a pretty wide customer base, whereas Adobe on the marketing side is an exceptionally high-end, complicated, and expensive system. So it felt like a match between, almost a kind of a luxury product and an everyday type solution, and that seemed a little bit of a mismatch for us. Supposedly, Microsoft is going to take another run at this. I think for their sake of their customer base, I kind of hope that they do, rather than just defaulting to Adobe on all this stuff. But we'll have to wait and see. So, okay, we're coming up to the bottom of the half hour, so just wanted to thank you all for joining us and invite you to stay in touch to find out what other webinars and other things we have for you. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any further questions. But for now, this is Tony Byrne and Scott Dill at Real Story Group signing off. Thanks again. Bye now.